Hello, everybody, and welcome back down here to the Gamer's Den with me, your host, Jordan, your master of lore and storyteller extraordinaire. Also with me today is my cutest co host ever, journeyman of lore and storyteller learner initiate, and Nora Lynn Espinosa. We're here with you today to bring you another fantastic episode, one of which that we both hope that you will enjoy immensely for running your games, and that is running nations, states of power, city states, kingdoms, empires, whatever massive nation you may have in your game, or nations, and how you fit them into your backdrop. And that is in particular when they go to war with each other. Now, something that's very important to keep in mind when setting up this kind of a setting, putting together this type of a story of two nations, two kingdoms, or even multiple kingdoms, or even a singular kingdom that's been suffered a realm divide and is split into two, three, four, even five separate warring factions, is that when it comes to this kind of warfare, there is typically a kind of cause for it. It's something that's intrinsic to the ethics of warfare, I guess you might say. When it comes down to it, even if when you look back to ancient times, like the Byzantine Empire, the Persian Empire invading the Greek city states, which was made famous with the movie 300, and the comic book series of the same name, is there's always a reason, there's always a preempting cause that brought these powers to the brink of warfare. As even back in ancient times, just leaping out and attacking your neighbors, attacking neighboring kingdoms, usually would damage your diplomatic relations with all the other neighbors, as well as tales of what your nation had just done would inevitably spread, and there would be backlash. And it's also, you have to consider that other nations will have alliances with other nations, and if one side does something to provoke the other, that would be cause for war. And whoever was provoked would be seen to be acting with a certain sense of justice, a reasonable cause to go to warfare. So, when it comes to running our games, our settings, and these particular stories, there has to be some sort of reasonable cause at the heart of the conflict. Now, that cause may start off as something small, a dispute between two lords, for example, like take what happened with Game of Thrones. Robert Baratheon went to war against the king, and he raised up a number of allied lords to go to war with him, all because the king's son had supposedly stolen away his bride, Eddard Stark's sister, Lyanna Stark, if I remember correctly. I have to look that up again. But either case, it's this would have been something of a smaller regional-ish dispute, but when this is coupled with the fact that the Mad King had already been burning several prominent nobles and lords at the stake and had been conducting just awful mad pogroms and just being an awful tyrannical ruler, clearly a madman and insane. It all stacks together and comes up to being something like the straw that broke the camel's back. It just was enough, and so several of the various kingdoms in the Seven Kingdoms rose up in revolt and marched on the Southlands. So that there was the cause for war, and it was seen as a just war. Granted, not everybody allied with the rebelling kingdoms, but enough did to make it a massive civil war, one of epic proportions, and certainly a fun tale to listen to and read about. Other examples, let's pull from real world historical examples, like the reign of Justinian and the Byzantine Empire, which at the time they would have still seen themselves as Romans. We just call it the Byzantine Empire in order to differentiate between the eastern portions of the empire and the west. So, anyways, Justinian had a dream. He is said to be one of the last emperors to dream in glory, gold, and bronze, and all these epic things. And his dream was to reunify and recapture the western half of the empire because North Africa had fallen to the Vandals. The Ostrogoths had taken over Italy and sat in Rome. And so he wanted to reclaim all of this, but he had to have cause for war. When it came to retaking Italy, for example, he was actually allied with the Ostrogothic queen at the time, and was great friends with her and her son, to the point that there was an agreement that if ever she was overthrown, she could flee with her family and take refuge in Justinian's kingdom. That's how close they were. He couldn't just up and attack her, as one, and damage and impugn his own honor, but secondly, what might the other nations he struck agreements with think? If he's willing to stab a friend in the back like that, how long before he turns on them? Doing something like that would create more problems in the long run. And most rulers, most generals, and leaders are smart enough to realize this. You can't just go to war and start attacking people all willy nilly for no reason. That just doesn't do. That makes problems. So he had to wait and wait until the point that a chance actually happened to favor him. The queen was actually, if I recall correctly, drowned, killed by one of her cousins, who took the crown and proclaimed himself king. Now he had a just cause for war. He was going to be avenging the deaths of the rightful rulers, and taking back this kingdom from this usurper. And he managed to do so with great success, using the help of one of the most capable generals in all of antiquity, and probably even further and more beyond that into more recent times, a man by the name of Belisarius. He was a massively effective general. It's insane. There's plenty of great series about him, in particular the Extra Credits channel. They have a series called Extra History, covers all of this, the reign of Justinian, and the reconquest of North Africa and Italy. It's fantastic. Go give it a listen, watch it. It's great stuff. Certainly, I find it to be a useful source for pulling in new campaign ideas, or at least NPC ideas, little stories that I can throw into the worlds that I make, or even if I'm running something pre-made. It's really useful stuff. Anyways, back to the matter at hand. Justinian had to wait for that just cause to go to war. And that war also had to be conducted honorably as well, within certain strictures and confines. Nothing that was written down like you'd see in the Geneva Conventions, but just something that was just generally agreed upon to be best practices by most people, most nations existing at the time. A great example of how ignoring these practices goes south was late in the campaign to reconquer Italy. Belisarius had been making his way north, and rumors had begun to spread back at home in the capital of the Byzantine Empire, in the Anatolia region, about Belisarius refusing to obey orders, refusing to comply with the court, and possibly making a name for himself as emperor in the west, while Justinian was in the east. And even though it's hard to say exactly, my take on it is Justinian didn't believe it, but the rumors were mounting enough and becoming believable enough within court that he had to do something, because his powers predicated on keeping the court loyal and acting with him in the nation's best interests. So he had to command Belisarius to come back, but Belisarius was this close to beating the Ostrogoths and finally breaking their power and keeping them out of Italy, basically, well, not forever, but for certainly long enough to make sure that Italy was going to be secured. He'd have Rome back. Rome permanently and well entrenched and back within Roman hands. And so, in order to hurry the war, the Ostrogoths had actually offered to make Belisarius king, because here was this great war leader. He had beaten all of their generals, their leaders, just cut through their armies, and this was clearly a man worth following. So they offered to make him king. And he had initially refused, but with his being called back to court, and even the demands that he returned to court by his friend and emperor Justinian, meant that he had to hurry. He wanted to finish this up. And so he had agreed to take the crown And then once he was inside of the this last city, this last major stronghold that was would allow him access to the rest of the Ostrogoth kingdom, as well as keep them locked out of northern Italy more effectively. He up and took the city with minimal amounts of bloodshed and said, "Nope, I'm not king. You guys are now under the rule of Justinian. Peace out. See you guys." And he went back to Italy. And the thing is, that shocked them because they had offered the crown to him with all with every genuine ardent desire that they could muster, every last bastion of honor, and they held Belisarius up as the most honorable of Romans because he had always beaten them honorably in combat. He'd used clever tricks and tactics, sure, but never something that was diplomatically deceptive like this. It was never a word of honor given and then yanked back at the last second. This was the first time that this had happened, but that permanently stained Belisarius's reputation because if the most honorable of Romans could do this, what are the rest of them going to do? They're not nearly as great and honorable as Belisarius was, and he proved to be a bit of a cheat as well. And that created cracks and fissures for the security of all of Italy because, well, the territory was not taken rightly, honorably. It was taken through deception. It was taken through lies, and so this just set the stage for future rebellions that would flare up and see the Italian peninsula lost to the Roman Empire basically for the rest of all time, if I remember right. Yeah, it just ceased to be. Rome would still be Rome, but would never really be in Roman hands again. And so that's the kind of thing that I think is important to think about when you're setting up these stories of nations going to war with one another. If is thinking about these conventions and how war was conducted, even within our own history, helps to make these conflicts seem that much more believable. It's there's a cause for war. There's a reasonable justification for war that leaves diplomatic standing intact with other nations and leaves a nation strong enough that they don't have to worry as much about being flanked on other sides of their empire or kingdom and being embroiled in wars of two, three, or even however many fronts. Um, so that sort of a thing is greatly important and really useful. And when these nations and empires don't adhere to that, what are the ramifications of that? Why aren't they? What's the reasoning for it? Is it because one general is trying to maintain their loyalty and trying to speed up the campaign to make sure that they have all of Italy conquered before they go back and potentially lose progress if they don't have everything linched together nice and tight? Or is it just that the character was always underhanded, greedy, and deceptive and is willing to use every deceptive means of guile and crude cunning to seize advantage over their enemies? These things are massively useful and really help to set the stage and the tone. And also, not only that, but God, just having a story of nations at war with each other, or even nations locked into a series of civil wars, like what you see out of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. Yes, it's a game series, but it's also based on a semi-historical-ish period. It was a period in time that happened in China's history, but it's called The Romance of the Three Kingdoms because the source material that we have on it was written a couple hundred years after the fact, after this time period had happened. So the documentation is a bit loose and definitely, well, romanticized, but it's something that really really helps to set the tone for the story that you're telling. It really creates the feel for the setting. You know, with the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, it's well, the dynasty had lost the will of heaven. They had lost heaven's backing, essentially. The heavens no longer deemed this particular dynasty fit to rule. And so, because the court was corrupt, the eunuchs that helped run the court were also massively corrupt at the time. Rebellions broke out all over, most famously the Yellow Turban Rebellion led by Zhang Zhao, uh, who, de- who I don't remember the full thing, but something in particular with the colors. There's like a system or pattern for the official colors for each dynasty and rule that rises up. Anyways, point being, Zheng Zhao led the Yellow Turban Rebellion up in the northeastern regions of China, and it just created this massive war that forced the court to call all these different lords together to marshal their armies and quell this rebellion because it was a seriously huge threat. And they did so effectively, but the regent for the court made a decision to try in order to try to prevent rebellions. He made all of these generals that had served so gallantly and effectively in this in the fight against the Yellow Turban Rebellion, warlords meant to keep control of their districts and empowered to raise armies, garrisons, and go and take the fight to any rebellious factions within their regions, and try to keep the kingdom stable. But when you empower a bunch of ambitious generals and nobles, um, it actually creates, unfortunately, a lot of tension and a lot of chaos. Well, clearly, as we get to see throughout out of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms series and all the Dynasty Warriors games, it just really just led to a great period of warfare where all these different regional warlords just went to war. Well, yeah, they went to war with one another and just started ripping each other apart. And it created this crazy system where eventually things settled down roughly into about three factions. You had Wei, Wu, and Shu. Wei was the northern kingdom under Cao Cao. Wu was under Sun Quan, Sun Jian, the Sun family, and the southeast, and then the Shu kingdom was in the southwest. And these three kingdoms went to war with each other, but at different times they had these different diplomatic ties with one another, different periods of peace, armistice, and ceasefires, and then resumed back to war and had all these clever stratagems and uh, and different plays that they would make. But it's just like I said, it creates this system of chaos where it feels like there's things just change dramatically from moment to moment, going from many dozens upon dozens of warlords condensing down eventually into three major kingdoms within China that were vying for ultimate control over the next dynasty for all of China. And the wars were massive, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, a scale of warfare that wouldn't be seen in Europe for quite some time. I don't think until the Second Punic War between Rome and Carthage, or maybe it was the First Punic War. Anyways, master of lore, but I don't remember everything off the top of my head like I would like. But I digress. Point being, there's always a cause for war. There's a predication for it. In this particular case, with the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, the cause for war was, well, there's this corrupt court. They were ruining China. People, the peasants were starving. Everything was in chaos. Bandits were roving around everywhere. And so Zhang Zhao decided that he was going to try to do something about it and started the Yellow Turban Rebellion to pull down this corrupt court, this ineffective dynasty, and give the people something better. That was his cause for war. And it was clearly effective because many people in this northeastern region of China felt that this was a just cause, and he attracted great warriors and generals to his cause. And in response, in order to try to keep everything together, the emperor and the regent for the court raised armies and empowered lords to also bring marshal their armies and fight against this rebellion. That was their cause for war, and in this case, both sides saw themselves as just, and just underneath a lot of the Confucian ideals of what is proper for your place in society and everything. That's a whole nother subject I could probably talk a little bit too long on. But the point being that there is a cause for war. It's very rarely ever done for no reason. And the last and third example I want to bring about here is one of my favorites because it's so relatively unique in history, and that were the Viking raids that occurred during the Dark Ages. And they're unique because for the uh, for the Scandinavian peoples at the time, their cause for war. You know, they were go on these raids and enrich themselves and gain glory, and dying on these raids with your sword in hand, your weapon in hand, would guarantee you a place in the halls of Valhalla at the great feast tables, and is all this. For them, this was cause enough. Being having the opportunity to fight and die honorably and greatly in battle, just entrenched and bloodied with glory. And even if you didn't die, if you succeeded, you came back with a ton of loot. Well, if it was a good raid, you came back with a ton of loot. Anyways, but when they came to the British Isles for the people that they attacked, these people appeared out of nowhere. And it wasn't armies of them, at least not at first. It was, little raiding groups, a couple of long ships here and there pulling ashore. But these people appeared as if from out of nowhere, these hulking behemoths with their great Dane axes, their strange, large, round shields, the way they would just leap up from the shore. The one thing that's important to note is that in the British Isles at the time, warfare was between, the various kingdoms that existed. And so the borders of the island, the beaches, the cliffs, and all of that. These were the water was a natural barrier that lent itself well to their defense. People didn't really attack from the sea, so you didn't need to quite build as many walls. You could focus more of your resources on the fortifications on the other, two or three sides that you had to be concerned with. And so that's why these places were so relatively undefended, and very few people would actually attack churches. That was seen as, it's one of those commonly held agreements and conventions. Raiding and sacking churches and murdering priests is kind of a bad thing in Christian nations, but it happened. But it wasn't. It was bad taste to do so, to say the least, and it gave people, well, it was cause for war. If you started butchering priests and sacking churches, you might find your own people turning against you because you're destroying sacred places of worship. Sure, it's in another kingdom, but God's above all that. And that will turn people against you if you start doing things that are particularly sacrilegious. But in the case of the Vikings, Christianity was a foreign concept. This was just a place, it was a place of worship, sure, that was probably easy enough to figure out, but it had a lot of riches and it was really really not all that well defended. And the people that were there were all these priests. These weren't warriors, these were just soft people that studied books and worshipped all day. So it was easy target, easy pickings, and coming back with a bunch of riches meant a lot of prestige. Didn't matter if you took it from warriors or not. It was just you were wealthy now. Fantastic. And so, for the Vikings, this was just a great deal, especially since there were a lot of churches and monasteries along coasts and plenty of cities along the coastlines as well too, or with easy river access that their longships could navigate up and attack at weaker points in the walls and the defenses. And so they could just raid, loot, rape, and pillage all the way through these towns and all over the British Isles and the northern coasts of France. Um, but for the victims of these raids, the early British peoples, the early French peoples, it's understandable how they would see these people as just demons spat out from hell, meant to punish them, because these men had no regard for civilians, for the unarmed priests, no regard for churches or the laws of God and man. They just went and raped and burned and looted and pillaged and destroyed everything, profaned everything that was sacred, and made off with treasures and slaves on board their longships, never to be seen again. You could see how these people would just be seen as utterly abhorrent to everything that these people had held sacred at the time, and why they were caught so thoroughly by surprise from it. And it builds up from there to where, they tried to fight back, but the Viking raids were unpredictable. Not only that, but when the Scandinavian peoples, this early, I want to say Swedish, but I'm not sure if that's right. These early northern peoples were making these raids. They were still incredibly smart. They were capable sailors and navigators, and that's part of what lent such a great deal of victory to their raids, was this tactical advantage they had navigating the seas in their longships and being able to take these longships up the rivers. It let them strike in unexpected locations, and when they did fight together, well, they had their own systems of fighting, but they were terribly effective, incredibly so. And it got to the point that some of these kingdoms and their nobles decided, you know what? It's cheaper to just bribe them and pay them off to go somewhere else. And so it created this system of tribute giving that would keep the Vikings from raiding and murdering everybody. But the other thing is, as the Vikings moved around and went on all these raids, a curious thing happened. They started coming across these new ideas, and as they took these slaves, and languages began to cross-pollinate and exchange, and not only that, but these Scandinavian northern settlements began to settle in on the British Isles, and these ideas began to exchange with one another, these cultures and traditions. The Vikings began to keep saying the Vikings. Vikings was just something specific for raiding, but these Northerners began to adapt to these new cultures. And not only that, not only did they adapt, but they started to realize, if we keep killing all these people, making all these neat and interesting things that we really like, we're not gonna be able to keep having them around very long. And you know what? It's cheaper and safer to just kind of trade. Sure, we can still fight. We can still find plenty of people to fight. We'll just range further out, and they really actually ranged very, very far. There were some raiders like Harold Hardrada, I want to say, yeah, Harold Hardrada, who ended up actually fighting and for the Byzantine Empire at one point in time before he went back to the British Isles to try to claim his rights as king. But he fought down as far in the Mediterranean, all the way up across from the British Isles and the regions of Finland and Norway and all of that. He just the How far the Vikings ranged was extremely amazing. Anyways, the point being is that even though they started off as these raiders, looters, and pillagers and were seen as utterly abhorrent at first, over time, as there was this cultural exchange between these people, these various groups of peoples, the Vikings moved from being these raiders to being great merchants and mercenaries, and they were still great warriors. They're massively effective as warriors. That culture and that tradition just was really strong for that at the time, and might still be. I'm not sure. Anyways, they adapted and grew and adopted these customs, and they recognized, yeah, we found these other ways of dealing with these people, and you know what? Raiding and butchering everybody kind of makes them not want to trade with us as much. So we'll just do it a little bit here and there, but we'll stop desecrating. We'll stop desecrating these churches, and we'll get along a lot better. We'll still fight, we'll still kill, still a little bit of raping, a little bit of pillaging, but no more desecrating churches and murdering the crap out of priests. And it did wonders for them in being able to become these great merchants and traders at the time. Anyways, I've rambled on long enough about history and different ways of looking at these great powers, these nations and cultures, and how they go to war with one another and how to depict them acting with one another. When you're trying to create this system where it is two or more nations at war or locked into a civil war within itself with multiple factions, remember there's always a cause for war, and it should be a reasonable cause and should be able to be seen as a just cause. Even when it comes to evil nations, if it's made up of mortal nations, they're still going to have a cause for war because they can fight one nation. They might even be able to fight two, but you can't fight everybody, and certainly not everybody all at once. For that, you have to have a little bit of tact, a little bit of diplomacy, and when you go to war, you have to have a just cause for it that you can argue with, use as ammunition for arguing in your diplomatic meetings with various nation states and groups. Anyways, I've been your host, Jordan, your master of lore and your storyteller extraordinaire. And this one here has been my most awesomely adorable co-host, Nora, lore master apprentice and storyteller extraordinaire in training. If you folks like this video, please consider giving us a like and a subscription. And if you do subscribe to us, click the bell icon over there so that way you get notified the next time we have great content uploaded here to the channel. Once again, we have been your hosts. We hope you have yourselves a good night.